Does that shot there look all too familiar to you? If you slice your driver, but less so your irons, I'm going to tell you today exactly why that is the case. This is without doubt the most difficult club in the bag to control, and we're going to share with you some tips and drills to help you straighten out your driver once and for all. So there's a few reasons why you slice the driver but not your other clubs, and I'll get into those shortly, but let's start with why the ball curves in the first place. The slice, or even the hook, comes about when there's a disparity between where the club face points at impact and the direction that the club is swinging. So in the case of a slice, we've got a club face that is open, pointing to the right for a right-handed golfer, of the swing path. So the direction of a golfer's swing might be to the left in this instance, an out to in swing path, and the club face would be pointing to the right of that. And the greater the difference between those two pieces, the bigger the curve. And that's especially true with the driver because it has the least amount of loft. And that's the first reason why you slice the driver more than you do any other club. The flatness of the face, the lack of loft on the club face, makes matching up those two vectors that I just spoke about, the club face and the club path, makes that the hardest, as opposed to a 7-iron or a pitching wedge that has significantly more loft. So one of the biggest reasons you struggle with the driver is the lack of loft. That's why a number of you might be trying higher lofted drivers, maybe 11, 12, even 13 degrees. It's also a reason why a lot of you will prefer your 3-wood or even your 5-wood as opposed to the driver. You'll almost get as much, if not more, distance out of that club, and you'll certainly be getting more control. So in order to improve the driver and reduce the slice, we have to reduce the amount the face is open to the path. And that's going to involve a discussion about the wrists. So why am I going to talk about the wrists? Well, the wrists control the club face, and ultimately it's this club face control, or lack of club face control, that's causing you to slice your driver. Let me elaborate. When it comes to the driver, it's the longest club in your bag, and it has the least amount of loft. And those two factors combined make it the most difficult to control. When I swing back with the driver, the likelihood is that you're going to swing this club further or longer than you would do with the other clubs. That's partly because of the length of the shaft. And it's also to do with the fact you're trying to hit this club as far as you possibly can. Now that may not seem like the biggest issue in and of itself, but let me elaborate. The longer your backswing gets, the more you tend to extend this lead wrist. Extension of this lead wrist describes how the wrist moves into this cupped or angled position. That directly influences the club face. It opens the club face. So lead wrist extension equals open club face. The more and the longer I swing back, the more open my club face gets. Once I'm in this position, I'm pretty much forced to come down in this very steep, over the top manner. You can see how the club face is still very open. And in order for me to hit any kind of functional shot, I have to swing excessively across the golf ball. It's that movement of the club across the ball with the face open that produces that slice that you're too familiar with. So in order to fix the slice, we have to fix the wrist. The wrist will solve the club face problem, and once the club face is in the right place, you can actually swing down on the correct path. Let me show you how that looks with Hack Motion wrist sensor, just to give you an indication of how these wrists work. So when I set up to the golf ball with my standard setup and my standard grip, I've got around 18 degrees of extension already built into that grip of mine, and that's okay. Slight amount of cupping as I grip the club here. But by the time I get to the top of the swing, in a good swing, that extension will have disappeared. You'll see there how the wrist's pretty much at zero. A flat left wrist for a right-handed golfer. You may have heard that term before. A flat wrist equals a square club face. Now, if I start to swing too far, you look at that number on the screen going from almost zero. If I now keep lengthening my swing and extending my wrist, that number changes dramatically. Nearly 50 degrees of extension there. That's opened this club face. And now if I was to swing down on a good path, I'd only be able to hit the ball significantly to the right. This club face rules everything. Once the club face is out of sync and it's not in the right position, the rest of your swing will react to try and compensate and correct that. So you have to get the wrist angles right. Let me hit one that's incorrect, just to show you what I mean. So standard setup, but I'm going to make this thing slice. I'm going to swing back too far, let my wrist extend too much, and we'll see what type of shot we get. There she goes again, off into the woods, never to be seen again. You'll see on the screen that I started there with around 20 degrees of extension at setup. I've already mentioned a small amount of extension in this lead wrist when you set up is pretty standard if you have a relatively neutral grip. It does depend on your grip as to what that number will say in the beginning, but around 20 degrees of extension is perfectly normal, pretty neutral, and that's not a problem at all. The problem comes at the top of the swing. You'll see that from 20 degrees of extension, I actually increased it by nearly another 30. 51 degrees of extension at the top of the swing because I allowed this swing to go back too far. I lost control of these wrists. So we have to stop that. We have to make sure we reduce how far back the club travels, manage the wrists so that the club face stays square, and then I can swing on the correct path into the ball. That's the only way to eliminate your slice once and for all. When it comes to training the correct wrist angles, it can be challenging to understand exactly where these hands and wrists need to be. That's where the HackMotion wrist sensor really does come into its own. The BioFeedback feature on this device really helps you to understand exactly where your hands and club need to be at the top of the swing. Using the BioFeedback, I'm going to show you what I mean. When set to the top of the swing parameter, this sensor is going to make a noise when it's in the correct range. It's also going to vibrate, but you obviously can't feel that sitting there watching this video. But you'll hear the noise when the wrist is in range. That allows me to swing to the top of my swing and find the correct range of wrist movement, not too little, not too much. Going to the top of my swing, I'll explain what I mean. When you set up, because there's a small amount of extension in my wrist, as I've already mentioned, you may not hear the sensor. That's okay. You may hear it as well. It doesn't matter too much. It depends on your wrist attachment. But I don't hear the noise at setup, but I certainly need to hear the noise when I get to the top of the swing, because as I swing back, I'm going to flatten my lead wrist. That wrist now is around 4 degrees of extension. It's basically a flat wrist. And you can hear that noise playing back to me from my iPad. Now, if I was to make the error here of lengthening the swing like I've spoken about today, longer, the lead wrist starts to extend too much, the noise disappears, and I now have the feedback that I've gone too far. I've extended this lead wrist too much and my club face is now open. That's the startings of the slice. So to train like this, you'd go to the top, make sure you can hear the feedback. If you don't have the wrist sensor, you have to sense and feel that your wrist is as flat as possible. Think Dustin Johnson. You remember the wrist angle, the extremely bowed or flexed wrist? That is the opposite of extending the wrist too much. So if I flex the wrist too much, I'm actually going to close the face excessively. And if you're a slicer, this is the feeling you want to strive for. If you have the wrist sensor, you're going to get that exact feedback at the top. Hold the wrist in place. Couple of little feels. Okay, that feels good. Go back to the ball. One more time. Flatten that wrist. And I hit one from there. And I know that I've controlled my wrist angles perfectly because that ball has flown perfectly straight. That's how you're going to train it when you do it yourself. You're going to go to the top, get a sense that the wrists are in the correct spot, and then you're going to hit from there. And the final piece to add to this drill is to make sure that your swing path begins to improve. You stop swinging from out to in. You'll be less incentivized to swing out to in once your wrist angles are fixed. But just to expedite this process and make it a little bit faster, go ahead and put your driver head cover on the ground, just placed outside of the golf ball in a position whereby if you did swing from out to in, you'd likely strike your head cover as you approach the ball. So the purpose of this head cover is to act as a barrier or an obstacle to encourage you to swing more from in to out in the downswing. So one of those just to finish, wrist, take your grip, make your back swing, get the club to be in position at the top via the correct wrist angles. There's the noise, swing down, miss the head cover. to the top. There's the noise, my wrist is flat. Swing down, miss the head cover. Up to the top and hit it. What you're going to find if you get this right is you're actually going to start to see balls tending to draw or even hook. And for those of you who've spent your entire golfing life slicing the ball, that will be a pleasant sight, I can imagine. So that's how you fix the driver. This is why you slice the driver, but not your irons. The extra length of your swing, the lower loft of the driver, and the poor wrist angles all come together to create this perfect storm of a slice. The tips I've shared with you today will certainly help you to reduce that once and for all. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you click on the link down in the description of the video to further wrist videos to help with your training.